So welcome to our workshop on teaching in a tense political climate. As everyone in this room knows, we have a very big, important national election coming up in the United States. And we also know that these sorts of moments can have a big impact on students' lives and particularly their lives as learners. So we at the Teaching and Learning Lab wanted to put together some resources to help you think about how you want to approach thinking about and talking about the election with your students. My name is Ben Hansberry. I'm the Assistant Director for Graduate Student Teaching at the Teaching and Learning Lab, and I help to sort of coordinate this kind of alliance between Professor Charles Stewart from Political Science, as well as some of our colleagues from the Division of Student Life to put together this workshop. So I'd like to start by introducing Ray Feller, who is going to sort of help us set the stage and understand the stakes a little bit. So with that, Ray, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ben. As Ben said, my name is Ray. I'm one of the deans in S-Cubed. And first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today or listening to the recording and for engaging in this kind of thinking. I really love working at MIT and knowing that there are so many great faculty and staff who really want the best for our students. So when we got together to talk about this workshop, we talked about the importance of capturing how these kinds of topics impact students. So today we're talking explicitly about the election, but really these ideas can apply to any major event that impacts the community, including impacting us. We floated the idea of bringing in a student to share their specific experience, but in talking about it, it occurred to us that I might be able to talk not just about one student's experience, but about a lot of them, because working at S-Cubed, I had ended out with, specifically from the 2016 election, quite a bird's eye view. So I'm going to take you with me for a moment, if that's okay, to my morning on November 9th, 2016. Now, I had been up most of the night, as I'm sure others can relate to. I was still refreshing the news in case it had somehow changed. I managed to get my then 2-year-old to daycare. I'm just going to share the screen here for a second. Hopefully people can see that. This is not the lunch that I made for my child, but I think it was something along these lines. It was a hard day. It was hard to focus and figure out what to even do with myself. So I got to the T. There was a huge delay back in the days when we used to take the T. And while I was waiting on the platform, I decided I would check my email, which I think looked something like this. And I stood on the platform, I looked at everyone else, I took the T in a daze, everyone looked miserable and exhausted. Now, personally, I have not set foot on MIT's campus since March 13th. So I thought it might be fun, or maybe not fun, but nostalgic, to visit Lobby 7 together right now. So here's Lobby 7. This is through the campus map. Google Maps connection here. This is where I normally start my day. You can see there's the infinite straight ahead. Here's where the cafe would be. And down here is the hallway where my office is. S-Cube's office is 3 doors down on the left. When I arrived that morning, around 9, our walk-ins, which usually start at 10, our walk-ins were already here in the middle of Lobby 7. This is where I saw students waiting to come and talk to somebody. So I could see people in all kinds of states. I could see a lot of red eyes, maybe from crying, maybe from sleeplessness, maybe from staring at the internet. I had to step over students sitting in our waiting area on the floor, leaning against the walls. And then I had to take a breath for myself, and I had to be ready to listen. There were international students who were terrified of what might happen to them and their ability to be here as students. There were LGBTQ+ students who were afraid of losing their rights to marry or to be themselves. Black students afraid of what this vote meant about our country and about racism here. DACA students afraid that they would lose their status. The students had questions that I couldn't answer, and I, of course, had my own questions about what lay ahead. And I remember meeting also with a Trump supporter who felt like they had to either hide their identity or face ostracism from their peers, which I know is also a challenge for a quieter portion of the population. And in the midst of everything, alongside their questions about the future, students were asking about how to manage their weeks. They still had piece sets, exams, presentations, papers, classes with mandatory attendance. They'd been up all night, they were full of dread for their futures, and with everything going on, they couldn't concentrate on the immediate tasks ahead, and they were worried that there would be academic consequences. So one of the interesting things I have noticed many times, including that day, was this sort of scenario where a student shares that they have something horrible going on, but they're terrified because there's something large that's due and they don't think they're going to get it done in time. They tell me they're worried they're going to fail the class, or that if they ask for something, it's going to upset the professor. I get them to bravely write an email explaining even a little bit of their situation, and they're shocked to find out that their professor cares. Now, I'm not shocked. Again, I get a bird's eye view, so I see reasonable and helpful faculty all the time, but it's not something that students necessarily guess. So as we brace ourselves for whatever is ahead this November, it's helpful to think now about how students read our responses to impactful events, be it an email, a comment in class, a discussion, or if someone does nothing. And I'm afraid they read a lot into that last option. If a faculty member says nothing and carries on as usual, students often interpret that as an expectation. They think that means they are not supposed to react or might be faulted if they do. However, when faculty or staff do say something, even a sentence that acknowledges that they know it is a tough time, it gives students permission to be human themselves. And I actually think it helps them get back on track a lot sooner because they're able to take care of themselves a lot better. Now, among the memories I have from that day, I also remember good things. Students looking out for one another, impromptu gatherings happening across campus, messages of solidarity coming from President Reif and others in the upper administration. And I remember students feeling appreciative of faculty who were flexible about deadlines or who sent out messages of warmth. I promise that students do not want to fall behind, but they do sometimes need to be able to breathe before getting back to their work. Now, in fact, I actually remembered one student in particular telling me how much they appreciated that their professor forewent his regular lecture and opened the floor for students to talk about their feelings and reactions and to share his own. And he had done it in a way that the student described as supportive, but without judgment. And I remembered clearly enough that I actually asked if he would speak with you all today. Now, I hope that I actually thanked you then, Professor Stewart. If not, I'll thank you now for the help that you gave 4 years ago. And thank you also for graciously agreeing to join us. I know that I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to share and that the others here are as well. And I'll mention that there's going to be a link in the chat for questions if they come up while you're listening, but I'll now turn it over to Professor Charles Stewart.
Thanks, Ray, for sharing that, and thanks to Ray actually for all you've done for our students over the years. Many of you know that I've been one of the, don't want to call myself one of the bleeding heart faculty members around here, but I've been somebody who's been quite involved with student support services for many, many years as a faculty member and a head of house for 23 years, chair of the Committee on Academic Performance for 3 years. People like Ray and her colleagues are really, indispensable for this place. And so thanks, Ray. And thanks to everybody for joining. So what I thought I would do is just say a few words from my perspective on kind of dealing with what might very well happen in this coming election, and do it from a couple of perspectives. One is as a political scientist in my day job, not because I think y'all have joined the call today because you want to figure out how the election's going to go, but I think that the possible paths that the election might go informs how we think about what we might how we might be engaging with our students after the election. So I do want to say some things as a political scientist who's following the election closely, and I'll tell you about that in a second. And then secondly, turn to what I did myself after the election in 2016 in my own approach. There, just to share with you what I did, and as I get into those remarks, it'll be, I hope, clear that my approach is not one that I would especially suggest everybody do, in part because I am a political scientist, and responding to something like the election is something I do in my day job, but rather there are elements nonetheless of that response I think could be generalized and could be thought about for faculty even who were not social scientists and felt like they could not talk about these events from any special domain knowledge. So excuse me, with that throat clearing, excuse me, quite literally, let me just say a few words about how I'm seeing the election going, and then how I think that that's going to affect how 2020 ends up unfolding with our students compared to 2016. And just as a bit of introduction, I've been spending the last 7 months running a project with a colleague, friend at Stanford University. The project is called the Stanford MIT Healthy Elections Project. And if you want to find out more about it, go to healthyelections.org and you can find out all about it. That's the only shilling I'm going to do for that program. But just to let you know that I'm spending a lot of time talking to election officials around the country, campaign professionals, journalists. I've talked to 2 New York Times journalists in the last 12 hours and 1 election director in the last 12 hours. And so that's my life these days, is deep into this. And so, I think we all know that, if you, when you read 538 today, you saw that Biden is up by about 9 points in the polls, and that's bolstered by the political trends in the battleground states that makes that lead to be a fairly solid one. That everything we're seeing in this election suggests that 2020 is not like 2016. It's true that Hillary Clinton had a similar lead over Donald Trump at this point 4 years ago. It was similar, but it wasn't identical. So Biden's lead is bigger. It's distributed differently, both geographically and in terms of where the demographics are. And that's one of the reasons why I think this is going to be a more solid lead, more likely to prevail, both at the popular vote level and at the electoral college level 8 days from now, and certainly compared to 2016. Of course, we've been wrong before, but that's still my sense, professional sense. One important detail, which I think is relevant to the topic here, is that although, in 2016, college-age students were the least Trumpy of all age demographics in the country, they've become even less Trumpy in 4 years than they were 4 years ago, which is to say that if there is, any reaction from students individually or as a group that arises because an aversion to Donald Trump as a person and as a symbol of a particular political impulse in America, that feeling is even more intense than it was 4 years ago. To put some numbers on it, 4 years ago, Hillary Clinton was leading Trump by among the under 30 demographic by 20 percentage points. It was like 60-40. Now it's gone up to a 30 percentage point lead. So, it's like 65-35. You never see divisions that big. So there you go. And I think that's relevant for our discussion. I think there's 3 scenarios. And when I talk around to journalists, talk to the public, 3 scenarios. The 60% scenario is that Joe Biden wins easily. And by easily, I don't mean easily like we've come to expect, like when Ronald Reagan won, or kind of big blowouts, but rather that there's kind of and I'll talk actually about some of the bumps on the road, because I think it'll be relevant as well in dealing with our students. But by that, I mean that I think by midnight on Tuesday night, it'll be clear what the road to 270 is, and that the political elite class in the country will be lining up around a peaceful, as they say, a peaceful transition of power in the presidency, although other parts of the federal government, other parts of the state government may be still up in the air. That's the 60% scenario. The 30% scenario is that Joe Biden has a lead, but it's much closer than the polls say right now. And it looks like we may be in for a long haul of a couple of weeks of something that kind of looks like Florida from 2000, maybe distributed across a number of states, with possible scenarios that might make the U.S. look like a banana republic. And then the 10% scenario is that Donald Trump wins. If he does win, it's unlikely it will be clear on Tuesday night or even Wednesday morning that that's the case. But I think we will kind of get a sense on Wednesday morning if this is going to go that direction or not. So it's a low probability event, but I think it's, 10% is greater than 0. It's something we need to think about. Now, I mentioned the 10% scenario and even the 30% scenario for the following reason, that if Donald Trump does win this election, I think we have to count on the reactions to this election being even more intense and severe than they were in 2016. Because I mean, my sense of 2016 was that it was hard hitting for many people because of how unexpected it was. And if it's even more unexpected this time, and given that opinions about Donald Trump and kind of white supremacy and those sorts of things are even more firmly ingrained right now, I think we can just count on the reactions being more people, more intense among the people holding them. We also, I think, have to assume that there's going to be social disruptions around the country. And I think this is relevant when thinking about our students, as most of them not living here in Cambridge. By the way, keep in mind, somebody tried to burn a ballot box in Boston yesterday. And last week in Los Angeles County. So there is already social unrest happening in bright blue places. We have to assume that these sorts of events are going to be occurring over the next 8 days, that given the outcome of the election, that they are going to be intense on either side. If Joe Biden wins, and if he wins by 60, comfortably, there's going to be a sizable group, probably a third of the people who voted for Donald Trump, who believe fervently that the election was stolen illegitimately. Many of those people have guns, and some of those people we know will try to act violently. We know that. And our students are likely to be places where that's happening. And these other, if again Donald Trump wins, we've seen the social unrest and the protests of the summer, and especially if Trump wins the Electoral College and not the popular vote, and especially if it looks like that he's been able to win the popular vote because of shenanigans in states, then I think that the possibilities for social unrest around not only issues of racial justice, but even broader coalitions around kind of democratic legitimacy will be possible too. So again, I think that's a 10% possibility, but I think we have to be ready for that. Think that through in the event it happens. And by the way, these sorts of scenarios are not the scariest ones. I've been wargaming with people around the country for the last several months. So that's kind of the professional side interacts with today's agenda. Let me say just a few words about what Ray alluded to and how I handled the situation in 2016. So 2016, I was teaching 1720, which is Introduction to American Government. We had actually rearranged the class. I had rearranged the class a bit to kind of focus on electoral things, American political thought and electoral related things before the election, so we would be ready for the election. Luckily, it was meeting on a Tuesday-Thursday schedule, so I got to fly back to Cambridge, take a nap, and show up in class at 3 in the afternoon on Thursday. But nonetheless, by Thursday, people were still shell-shocked, and it was clear that a number of people in the class really wanted to talk about it and wanted to talk about it with me and with each other. And so I've described this as sort of a, my version of therapy. Makes me wish I had actually taken pastoral counseling when I went to Yale Divinity School. Anyway, but this was my approach. The first thing to say is just to note that I am a political scientist, and I did, this wasn't how I led it with the students, but in the back of the mind for me, and I noticed there's some, at least one colleague and some others who would view this in a similar way. In the back of my mind, I did view this as a teachable moment, ultimately, to kind of get some material across around political science. Some of the things that we were learning could help the students come to grips with and understand what they saw as happening. And I would hope that as a community, should we get in a position, for instance, where Donald Trump wins again, that part of the larger reaction will be to actually use our minds and to use the fact that we are at a university to, kind of do some heavy intellectual work around this issue. But that's not how I, approached it with my students at the beginning. My approach was, first of all, immediately to recognize the shock that I was surprised. To mention to them that, not to make this all about me, but to note that in my own lifetime, the election of 1980 was similar to this. I'd lived through something before like this, in the sense that 1980 was a shock, not that Ronald Reagan won, but that the Senate also went Republican, and there was a real possibility that 50 years of the New Deal and 30 years of the Great Society, the social safety net, maybe those sorts of things would be gone in the next couple of years. And that was something that people really hadn't thought about before, and now had to process really quickly. Stanford, where I was at, there were protests and demonstrations and teach-ins, and there were things that students and faculty and others did, and I would imagine similar things would happen. So to bring in this experience from my past, I thought was important. I think it helped to talk about that. Ray mentioned her talking to a student who had supported Trump, and I knew for a fact, because I had talked with them, there were several students who in the class who were fervent Republicans who voted for Donald Trump. One of whom I know ended up leaving MIT because he felt uncomfortable, not because of the Trump thing, but just sort of felt like he was being judged for being conservative. But I knew those students, and I knew who they were, and I didn't call them out in any sense, but I wanted to recognize that there were people in the audience that spoke for Trump. But actually, I've jumped ahead to say that after talking about recognizing the shock and keeping in mind that there were students who voted for both Trump and for Clinton, that I did feel important that, given the nature of Donald Trump, and especially the xenophobia and what even then was clear appeal to racists, to make it very clear that there were parts about the Republican platform that I thought one could honorably defend, even if I disagreed with them. And we had been talking about some of those things, ranging from free market economy to anti-abortion stances, to social conservatism in general. In my view, I told them and reiterated that I thought that that's why we had politics, is to talk about those things. These issues are perennials in American politics. They will never go away, and they are honorable positions for people to take. But that xenophobic phobia and racism are not honorable. And personally, and MIT has taken those positions. And so that is a line that I won't go beyond, and I won't defend. And I hope, we can certainly talk about those things, but I wanted to make it really clear that to the degree that I was going to try to create space for people who might have chosen to vote for Donald Trump to feel comfortable with the decision, I wanted to make it clear that there were some lines that I wasn't willing to cross, and MIT wasn't willing to cross. Nonetheless, acknowledge both sides. But especially at the end, when I came back, not to be too, kind of two-siderist to this, to return at the end to the students who were feeling, threatened because of who they were and who they felt that Donald Trump was, and to acknowledge that, that was likely to be the main concern in the room. So we talked. I mean, people kind of talked. They mostly, kind of talked about their surprise, and wanted to know maybe some information things about, protests and stuff like that. Does it ever work, et cetera. And we didn't spend very long. I would say the whole, pre-class time was, kind of the throat clearing and then the just kind of, I would say processing the issue was maybe 10 minutes, although I did end up throwing out the lecture and, spent the rest of the time going back and forth between kind of processing the shock and talking about the issue as a professional, which again, I understand is not going to be relevant for most faculty on the call, most teachers on the call. But in my case, I was able to go kind of back and forth. But I would end there by saying, I think that one of the things for a workshop like this is also to recognize that if there is kind of a shocking outcome to this, that it doesn't all have to be processed in the classroom, and that we as a community also need to think about the other ways that people like me and Chap Lawson and my other colleagues in political science and history and anthropology and other places, urban studies, can also have larger community events where some of this can also help as well, so that our colleagues don't feel like they have to be both physicists and political scientists as well. So those are my thoughts, both kind of where I think the world is going. It's just some kind of personal testimony to what I've done. As Ray said, I have come to the conclusion independently. My lived experience is that just acknowledging things that have happened in the world really helps to manage stuff. And I've done that in other areas, like when we closed down the campus, when Bexley Hall almost fell over. There's other things that happen that aren't always traumatic electoral results. And so I think there's also some general things that we can take from talking about this as well. So I'll turn it back to the folks in charge, and happy to see where this goes.
Thanks a lot, Charles. So I think we can maybe take 1 or 2 minutes if there are any sort of really burning questions that you want to ask here. There's also going to be opportunity for you to sort of discuss your ideas in a breakout group activity, which will follow this sort of brief Q&A. There's one question that I think we can start with from the Slido. Remember that you can contribute questions and also upvote questions. From a political science perspective, and this is the question, from a political science perspective, what do you view as the positives of both sides that could be part of a post-election discussion?
Positives of both, I assume both sides meaning of the two candidates. I think that on the Biden side, again, to try to stay away from kind of partisan stuff, but things that I think our students would gravitate toward generally. On the Biden side, there is kind of the engagement of young people in politics, and a sense that this election has made it clear that there is going to be a new generation of politics, and to just note that there's a number of issues that, even sometimes Biden had to be pulled into acknowledging that are going to be grappled with over the next 20 years. And so this is in some ways almost like a John F. Kennedy moment. A torch has been passed to a new generation, even though the next president is going to be over 70s, in the late 70s, nonetheless. So that's, I'd say, kind of on the Biden side, something maybe think about as a positive. I mean, on the conservative side, again, I mean, in some ways, not being in that tribe, I don't want to speak on that side, other than to say, I would, again, I don't agree politically, but I do think that much of the energy that comes to supporting the candidacy of Trump emerges out of a deep, kind of strong pro-life position, and strong pro-life position and kind of traditional values. And now you put those two things together and there's going to be a clash. But I would just point out that pro-life positions are not racist, and in fact, there's a strong argument, there is a strong criticism of certain things like eugenics, et cetera, within the pro-life movement. And so, but even just kind of talking this through, it's obvious that it's kind of fraught to kind of make up on the fly, kind of the good in both hearts that we might want to kind of have talk to each other. I'll just note, by the way, that the students, when they ended up talking to each other, even the Trump supporters and the Clinton supporters, were incredibly respectful of each other. And that is one of the things I've noticed in all the classes I've taught, is that in the moment, they really try to be respectful of each other.